Okay, well, welcome to Boyce Thompson Arboretum. We're here to do the Plants of the Bible Land walk. We're going to see a number of plants that are mentioned in the Bible. We'll read the scripture verses and we'll talk about those plants. And in many cases, it helps to understand those verses if you understand the plant that it's talking about, as the people in the Bible days did. The walk we've picked to do today is the what I call the unusual plants walk. I do 3 different walks. One is food, one is trees, and this one, unusual plants, which is really kind of a collection of different plants and oddball plants that don't really fit into the other two. We'll see some very interesting plants today. But the climate of central Arizona, which is where we are, is very similar to the climate of Israel. So it's not surprising to find plants native to the Holy Land doing well in a central Arizona botanical garden. The people of the Bible lived and worked a lot more closely to the land than we do today. They relied on their knowledge of the plants, the animals, the climate, the geology for their very survival. Today, we go to the supermarket. So we have lost a lot of that knowledge that they had in Bible days, and that's one of the things I try to bring out in these walks, is give you an idea of how the people of the Bible thought of the plants as they were mentioned in the scriptures that they read. Plants are mentioned throughout the Bible. Food, farming, plant products. They're used in metaphors, similes, and symbolism. The count is in Genesis alone, there's about 250 different mentions of plants and things related to plants. And this surprises many people that the Bible speaks so much about plants. So we'll see the plants that are likely mentioned in these verses, and there's varying degrees of certainty. We're not always sure exactly what plant a verse is talking about. And there's several reasons for this. The botanical nomenclature that our botanists use today was developed only in the mid-1700s by the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus. So obviously the Bible does not use the botanical nomenclature. What it often does is it uses a word that describes a characteristic of the plant, often something more similar to the common names that we have for plants today, which are nothing more than what the people who live where the plant grows call that plant. A good example is thorns. There are 12 different Hebrew and 3 different Greek words in the original languages of the scriptures that are translated into our English Bibles as thorns or thorny plant or something similar. So, what do you do? Which thorny plant is it talking about? I'm often asked, well, what was the thorn that was put on Jesus Christ's head when he was crucified? We don't know. There's been a number of different guesses, but that's one that's very hard for us to determine. We have 4 plants on the Arboretum grounds that are called crucifixion thorn or crown of thorns. And 3 of them were not used on Jesus Christ because they're native to Central and South America, not the Middle East. So the common names can get confusing. And of course, many plants have been introduced into Israel just even within the last century or so that did not grow there in Bible days. So we can't really go over there and look at what's there now without asking, was it there 2,000-3,000 years ago? And of course, some plants that did grow there in Bible days no longer grow there. And some plants have never been native to Israel, but were brought in from different parts of the ancient world because of their high value and usefulness. For example, frankincense comes from southern Arabia. Spikenard comes from the foothills of the Himalayas. And ebony comes from India and Ceylon. None of those have ever grown in Israel, but they're mentioned in the Bible. We're certain of plants that have high economic importance. Pomegranates, olives, dates, all important foods in Bible days, and they're still important foods today. When the Bible mentions those, we're sure what it's talking about. We're not certain of things like roses, flowers, fir trees, pine trees, cypresses. When the Bible mentions those, sometimes it's just a best guess at what plant, exactly what plant it's talking about. And then there's translation issues. Oftentimes, the translators are not botanists. They do the best they can, but sometimes a botanist needs to come in and take a look at things. So some of the English versions are a little bit questionable in how they handle the translation of words that refer to plants. So I like to look at the original languages kind of as best I can to kind of determine exactly what plant, or at least what plant's probable, that we're talking about in that particular verse. So, you know, with all that, we're going to head out onto the grounds. I think today we're probably going to look at about 14 or 15 plants, and we'll talk about the Bible mentions of them and kind of help open up those verses by seeing the plant through the eyes of the people of the Bible days. These are irises. They're cultivars that have been bred by man to be beautiful. But the wild irises that grew in the Middle East are mentioned in the Bible. They're frequently mentioned, it's translated in the English versions as lilies, so you really may not connect the iris with those particular verses. Hosea chapter 14 verse 5, I will be as the dew unto Israel. He shall grow as the lily and cast forth his roots as Lebanon. The identification of the biblical lily is difficult. As I said at the beginning, most flowers are a little hard to do. But the Hebrew word Shushan, which is usually translated lily, is believed by many scholars to be referring to the wild iris, which is usually yellow, or it's also called a yellow flag. Esther chapter 1 verse 2. Then in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, there's that same word, Shushan, which in most places of the Bible is translated as lilies. So the name of the city where Esther was is Shushan. Book of Esther takes place in the city of Shushan. It's the winter residence of the Persian kings. And Shushan is actually mentioned about a dozen times in Esther. Psalm 45 in the title, to the chief musician upon Shoshanim, for the sons of Korah, Maskil, a song of loves. Now Shoshanim, in English, when we form a plural on words, most of the words are done by adding an S or an ES. Flower, flowers. In Hebrew, a plural is often formed by adding an IM and sometimes changing the vowels within the words. Shushan, Shushanim. So what is being referred to when they say, you know, to the chief musician upon Shushanim? Scholars aren't exactly sure what's being referred to here. Is there a musical instrument in David's day that reminded people of the iris and they called it Shushan? We're not really sure exactly what that means in the title of that psalm. The iris is a very beautiful plant, blooms in the spring like this, so we're lucky to be here today. This is a tamarisk tree. The botanical name is Tamarisk articulata or Tamarisk aphylla or several other ones. As I was studying these several years ago, I discovered that there's 5 different species of tamarisks that look very similar. In fact, if you want to tell the species apart, you have to be a trained botanist in the field at the right time of the year when they're in bloom and have brought your field microscope so you can look for minor differences in the flowers to determine which species it is. We read from the account of Ishmael and Hagar. Now, Abraham and Sarah were promised an heir by God. It didn't happen right away. Sarah grew a little impatient and told Abraham, take my maid Hagar and have your heir by him. And that was the birth of Ishmael, son of Abraham and son of Hagar. Well, sometime later, the promised son was born to Sarah. That was Isaac. And Abraham threw Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness to die. Genesis 21:15, and the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. Genesis 21:33, and Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Fast forward several hundred years to the burial of King Saul, the first king of Israel, and his 3 sons, 1 Samuel 31:13, And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Now we read 3 verses. We saw a shrub, grove, and tree. So how does this connect with the tamarisk? Well, if you look in those 3 verses, you will find the same Hebrew word, eshel, used in all 3 verses. The translators dealt with it differently. But the meaning of eshel we can often assume from the locations and what grows there. For example, Saul and his sons buried at Jabesh. Well, around Jabesh, tamarisk are very plentiful. So it was very likely that it was under a tamarisk there. This looks like a pine tree, but it's not. If you look very closely at the leaves, what you'll see is there's a very thin twig that has tiny leaves wrapped around it, scale-like, almost like a lizard. So it's not really pine needles you're seeing, it's these leaves wrapped around it. Okay, this is an oleander bush. The botanical name is Nerium oleander. The verse I have that fits this is from the apocryphal books of the Bible. Those are the books that are generally between the Old and the New Testament. They're in Catholic versions of the Bible. They're not in most Protestant versions of the Bible, but they make interesting reading. The book of Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus 39, verse 13, "Hearken unto me, ye holy children, and bud forth as a rose growing by the brook of the field." As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of controversy over roses and other flowers, what exactly they are. But many scholars think that this is a reference to the oleander. In its native habitat in the Middle East, the oleander grows near watercourses, which may run seasonal or dry most of the year. So the oleander, which is in an area that's very similar to its native habitat, the other side of it is Queen Creek, which is a dry wash right now. So this would be very much like its native habitat in the Middle East. And the description, bud forth as a rose growing by the brook of the field. That's a hint that the oleander is probably what the rose talked about in this verse is. Some scholars have suggested that the oleander is the gopher wood that Noah used to build the ark. Problem is, I know what oleander looks like. And if I'm going to build a boat out of these little twigs, I'm thinking bathtub toy, not Noah's Ark. I don't think those scholars have actually seen oleanders. This is one of the tall, beautiful, strong Cedars of Lebanon. Cedrus Lebanon is the botanical name. Of course, this is still a youngster. Where the Bible tells us that King Hiram of Tyre in Lebanon provided Solomon with beams made from the cedars of Lebanon that Solomon used to build the temple in Jerusalem. Some of the best building materials in that part of the ancient world was the cedars of Lebanon. They were huge, they were very durable, they had a beautiful fragrance. And they were used in boat and building construction by many different ancient civilizations when they could get them. 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 6, "Now therefore command thou that they hew me cedar trees out of Lebanon, and my servants shall be with thy servants, and unto thee will I give hire for thy servants according to all that thou shalt appoint. For thou knowest that there is not among us any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians." So what we have here is the invoice from King Solomon to King Hiram saying, "Send me Cedar of Lebanon beams and your skilled woodworkers to help me build the temple." Also at the time of the rebuilding of the temple after the Babylonian captivity, Ezra chapter 3 verse 7, "They gave money also unto the masons and to the carpenters, and meat and drink and oil unto them of Zidon and to them of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea of Joppa, according to the grant that they had of Cyrus king of Persia." Okay, note this. Note the details in this. This was not just an invoice, this was the shipping bill also. The logs traveled by sea to Joppa. Bring it to the Sea of Joppa, and Joppa is due east of Jerusalem on the coast of the Mediterranean. It's one of the oldest seaports in the world. And it was used for shipping the cedars from Lebanon, brought them to Joppa, then went overland straight east up the hills to Jerusalem. In fact, we have Egyptian records from even a little bit earlier than the time of Solomon that describe cedars coming down from Lebanon to Egypt by sea. Same kind of thing. They were good building materials. Then Israel and Egypt did not have good building materials like the huge cedars of Lebanon. They had to be imported. The cedar of Lebanon is very tall and strong. It can grow to about 120 foot tall, an 8-foot diameter trunk. And some have even been known to get a little bit larger than that. Psalm 92:12. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. The reference to the height and strength of the cedar. If you go to the Temple Mount today, and you go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, and you look at up in the ceiling, there's beams, part of the structural support of the mosque, and there's boards, decorative boards nailed into them. And if you pull those boards off, as they've done when they've done some refurbishing work in the mosque, you can see some very old-looking beams being used. And you can also find in some other places on the Temple Mount, there's a pile of beams kind of put away, actually, unfortunately, kind of weathering. And you look at these beams, they have holes and they have notches in places that are not useful in their current use. And you wonder, these look like they're reused lumber. And that is very common in the ancient world. Some of these beams have been carbon-14 dated to almost 3,000 years old. 3,000 years ago, King Solomon was building a temple. So these beams have also been studied. They're cedar of Lebanon and they're Mediterranean cypress trees, good building materials. Now, archaeologists are frequently finding what they call secondary use building materials. A building is built, for some reason it's destroyed, earthquake, war, whatever. Instead of going and cutting down new trees or cutting out new rocks from the quarry, what they will do is they'll gather up usable building materials from the destroyed city and they will reuse them to build their new city. Very common in the ancient world. And often more than secondary, often it's used a third or a fourth time. If it's still good and usable, of course, we wouldn't think of doing that today. We wouldn't pass a code inspection if we did that. But what archaeologists think happened? Solomon used these timbers, the cedars of Lebanon from King Hiram, to build his temple, also some Mediterranean cypress trees. The temple was destroyed in 586 BC, and the Jews were carried off to Babylon for the captivity. When they returned around 520 BC, time of Ezra and Nehemiah, were rebuilding what's called the Second Temple, they probably reused these beams that were still left over from the first temple and still usable. Of course, a major remodeling of the temple was done in 70 AD, or was done just before the time of Christ. That's the temple that Christ walked in. That was done by Herod. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD at the time of the Jewish revolt by the Roman legions. Later, these beams were collected and were used to build the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where they still stand today. Earthquakes in the late 740s AD and again in 1927 damaged the mosque, and it had to be rebuilt somewhat. But if you go up there today, you'll find the beams still in use in the mosque that were probably the beams that started out as cedars of Lebanon sent by King Hiram to Solomon to build the temple. The cedar of Lebanon, by the way, is also the tree that is on the flag of Lebanon today. So you can see it's a very beautiful, strong-looking, huge tree. This is a red squill plant. The botanical name is Drimia maritima, or Urgentia maritima, as the sign on it says. Botanists keep changing the names. This grows wild in almost every district of Israel. The Hebrew hasav also means big jug or pitcher. And if you look day down in between the leaves, you'll see these leaves are actually coming out of a large bulb. Another name for this plant is sea onion, because of the large bulb that they grow from. The life cycle of this plant is very interesting. The shoots come up from this large underground bulb in around late October or November, and they're green and beautiful all winter long, through about April. Since this is the end of April, exactly what we're expecting, the leaves all die off, turn brown. They'll just stay here kind of as a rosette around this bulb. In August and September, a bloom stalk will come out of the center of the rosette of leaves. A thin stalk goes up 4 to 6 feet in the air, and there are 250 to 250 small white 10 millimeter across flowers at the top of the stalk. It blooms from the bottom up. The flowers on the bottom start to bloom, and when they finally close and die, flowers further up the stalk comes up, and there's up to 30 flowers opening per day. So it's not in bloom for a very long period of time, but it also blooms at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So if you really want to see them at their peak, you have to come out here in the middle of the night. It produces nectar until about 5 a.m. This attracts pollinators to it. And by 7 p.m. the next day, the flowers will wilt and die, and the next set of flowers up the stalk come up. So flowers open for about 18 hours only, and as it goes up the stalk. There is a tradition that Joshua planted squill to mark the borders of Israel and the tribes when he divided up the land when they came into the promised land from Egypt. He planted them along the borders. Squill, it's said that squill cripples the wicked because it prevents them from moving the boundaries. The leaves are supposed to be a skin irritant, and they also have a long tap root that comes down from this bottom of the bulb that is extremely difficult to dig up. It's very difficult to dig up a squill and transplant it to change the boundaries. You really can't do it too well. Squill was also planted to demark the boundaries of the fields that the people owned, and still very common all around Israel today. Deuteronomy 19:14, "Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land, that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it." Well, not specifically referring to squill. Based on some of these old traditions, it seems like squill is what's being talked about in this verse, being used as a boundary. Leaves and bulbs are poisonous. Most animals won't eat it, but it's said that gazelles will. And there's a tradition from the Jewish Talmud that says that Noah prepared squill for gazelles that he carried on board the ark. In some other areas of the Mediterranean, it's called the bulb of the dead, because it was traditionally planted in graveyards. In fact, if you go over to Jerusalem today, you will find a Muslim cemetery near the closed Golden Gate of Jerusalem that has a lot of squill in it. This tree has the distinction of being the first tree mentioned by name in the Bible. Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, "And the eyes of them both, Adam and Eve, were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." Well, either fig leaves grew bigger in the Garden of Eden, or Eve was a very good seamstress. These are not very comfortable leaves. If you feel them, they feel a little bit sandpapery, and as they get older, this is still spring, as they get older during the summer, they will take on a very rough sandpapery feel. So not very comfortable to cover nakedness. The Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. "For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell." These verses speak of springtime, and in the springtime, The fig tree puts out green figs. Now, when you normally think about a green fruit, you think unripe fruit. That's not the case with the fig tree. Green figs are the winter crop. They start growing in the late winter and then come to full maturity in the spring, right around late March and April. This tree has already produced the winter crop, and they've dropped off. We don't harvest them. But again, in the summer figs will come out, probably starting in about a month from now, and they will grow over the summer. Now, the summer figs are a little bit bigger, they're darker colored, they're better tasting than the green figs, but the green figs are still quite edible. And that's what this verse is talking about when it mentions green figs, not unripe figs, but the winter crop of figs. There are some hidden plants in the Bible that are really easy to miss. Most of them are words that are brought in from the original languages by the translators without trying to translate them, but they're just kind of brought in. We read the account of Jesus coming into Jerusalem shortly before his death, Matthew 21:1. And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem, and were come to Bethphage, unto the Mount of Olives, then sent Jesus two disciples. Now, Bethphage comes from the Hebrew, which means green figs. So, Bethphage, the house of green figs. Kind of a hidden. You might not realize that it's there. Matthew 21:19, and when Jesus saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it and found nothing thereon but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. This was at the time, shortly before his death, when we would have expected the green figs to be ripe and ready to eat. So when Jesus came to the tree, he saw no figs on it. He knew that the tree had not produced fruit. Otherwise, he would have found a lot of green figs, the winter crop of figs, ready to eat. Thus, he was disappointed, and he cursed the tree for not bearing fruit. Joel chapter 1, verse 12 reads, The vine is dried up, and the fig tree languisheth, the pomegranate tree, the palm tree also, and the apple tree. Even all the trees of the field are withered, because joy is withered from the sons of men. This, interestingly, we just spoke about the fig tree, and just about 25 feet away from it, here is an apple tree. There's several Hebrew words that are translated as apple. Here it's the Hebrew word tapuach. There's another Hebrew word, keep me as the apple of the eye, hide me under the shadow of thy wings. The Hebrew ishon is often translated as apple, but it really means the center or the dark part. Thus the apple of my eye is the dark pupil of the eye. And this kind of phrasing occurs a number of times. Genesis 1:17, the connection with the fig tree we just talked about, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Adam and Eve ate the apple and then covered themselves with fig leaves. Wait a minute, does the Bible say apple? No, it doesn't. But everybody knows Adam and Eve and the apple. Everybody knows that story.